watching Ukraine Today. My name is Olga Milchevsky, and joining us is Paula Jon Dobriansky, former U.S. diplomat and foreign policy expert on Eastern Europe. Good afternoon, Ambassador Dobriansky. Thank you very much for joining us. And,
thank you.
From what you see during your current visit to Ukraine, what is your perspective on the current situation around the Ukrainian government leader choosing?
Well, I think the situation right now points to a very important need for a resolution. And I think that it's important for Ukraine internally because this particular issue needs to be resolved in order for the Ukrainian government to move forward effectively and efficiently on its reforms and on its modernization. But also, secondly, if it isn't resolved soon, it also has an impact on Ukraine's perspective from the outside. In other words, its credibility will be impacted. So I will say, from listening to different interlocutors on this issue, I think that there's an urgency in resolving the issue.
Our Minister of Finance, Natalia Yareska, was born and educated in the United States. And
I know her.
That's excellent. And in your opinion, what results can have Ukraine if Natalia Yareska would be head of Ukrainian government, and if the head of Ukrainian government would be Mr. Groysman, who is currently supported by the president's political party?
Well, you know, I'm not going to speculate on that. I don't think it's appropriate for me as an outsider to comment on two individuals who both have records in which they have demonstrated themselves to be able to advance goals and objectives desired by Ukraine. In both cases, they have achievements, and I think their achievements stand on their own. Mr. Groysman, I understand from this visit, people have talked about his budget and his involvement in the budget issue last year. And for Natalia Yareska, I've known her for many years. I think her record points to the work that she's done in terms of the debt rescheduling issue. So I think the point here is it's not to comment on the individuals. I think what is important is that there is a resolution to this issue because, as I said, it won't advance the need to move forward domestically on crucial reforms. And secondly, it impacts how Ukraine is perceived from the outside. And it's important for Ukraine to have a strong and credible stance so that it can also get the kind of support that it needs to back its objectives.
How could that influence, that situation, influence the politics of IMF towards Ukraine, in your opinion?
Well, Christine Lagarde, the head of the IMF, has stated very clearly that she wants to see Ukraine move forward with not only economic reforms, but also reforms in the area of rule of law, those that undergird some of the challenges dealing with corruption here. And so from that perspective, I think it's, again, very crucial that there is a government that is together, unified in terms of its purpose, political purpose, and moves forward. I think that clearly, with Ukraine having achieved a debt rescheduling that was challenging in the last year, it achieved every single sector. The only area that I believe and I understand was not resolved was that with Russia. But all the other interlocutors did, and I think that was a very significant achievement. So the question is, what is the way forward for this year? And part of the package and part of the commitment was, in order to get a further rescheduling and a further support from the IMF, we have to have here a clear demonstration that it's not just one or two reforms, but it literally is movement forward.
Coming from Ukrainian policy to American, from your great experience and you're being called as a key policy maker in the administrations of 5 U.S. presidents, and from that great experience with Democrats and Republicans concerning the elections in the United States, there is a concern, let's say, in Ukrainian society that if there could be Mr. Trump, a president of the United States, then the politics of the United States could be changed. The politics towards Ukraine. What is your opinion on that subject? Is it possible that the politics of the United States could be changed under Mr. Trump?
Well, let me make two comments in this regard. First, with regard to Mr. Trump's candidacy, I don't know what his position is. So it's hard for me to really respond to your question directly on that. But what I can tell you is there's not only the executive branch, but there is our congressional branch, and there have been many senators who have spoken very much to the issue not only of support for Ukraine, but also they've expressed their concern about the Russian aggression into eastern Ukraine and what this portends for not just only Ukraine, but for all of Europe. So I think you have both Republicans and Democrats in the United States Senate and House who are senators and congressmen who are speaking to the issue, and I think will continue to speak to the issue. And then let me also remind the importance of civil society. You have many Ukrainian Americans, the diaspora, you have businessmen, you have academics, you have many people who come here and are connected into Ukraine. They have a stake in seeing Ukraine succeed, and they have a commitment to working with Ukraine toward that end. So as for our presidential elections, we'll see how that unfolds and who emerges as the Democrat and Republican candidate. But secondly, I think that you also have support from many, many sectors in the United States.
Thank you very much for that great news. And also, I want to go back to Crimea and the situation, the political and war situation in Ukraine, let's say. Is Crimea still on agenda, in your opinion?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I would say that to really sum up what the policy is, it's a non-recognition policy of the illegal annexation of Crimea. Crimea is part of Ukraine. And secondly, let me say, you asked if it's on the agenda. There are many institutions, just not only governmental, but non-governmental, that are also focused on what is the situation in Crimea today. There have been reports from the OSCE, also reports, I believe, from Freedom House, from the sharing of information, a great deal of concern about the issue of human rights there. So, yes, it is very much center and very much on the minds of many.
Is there any possibility for Ukraine to get the lethal weapons from U.S. government?
Well, you know, our Congress, again here, both Republicans and Democrats alike, came together a couple of years ago and, in fact, even very aggressively put forward their views that it was necessary to meet Ukraine's request for military weaponry. And toward this end, their commitment has been sustained. They want to see that happen. I happen to be an advocate of that. However, in terms of the approach taken by the U.S. administration, they have opted instead for a more what constitutes incremental approach. I believe some of the requests have been met, but not, for example, the Javelin, which was one of the requests. But here, there has been a different perspective. But let me say that there is a mandate put forward by our Congress to advance that. I support it. Others support it. And we'll see if that's something that will materialize in the time ahead.
Russia is going on with a quite aggressive informational war towards Ukraine. In your opinion, should Ukraine respond somehow to that informational war?
I think so. I think Ukraine as a whole, and not just government, but I think civil society, I think businessmen, women, in this context really need to respond. When you hear untruths, I think it's a responsibility. And why is that? It's because if you don't respond, then I think those that might not get information then form certain opinions. And I think in this regard also, it's important with your neighbors, meaning Europe at large, no less in the United States, to challenge that misinformation or disinformation, as we call it. There's been a substantial investment from Moscow in information and disinformation, and I think it must be countered.
In your opinion, what concrete steps should Ukrainian government make to have effective results in that informational war, let's say?
Well, when there are untruths, as I've indicated, it's imperative to come forward and to challenge it and to point out that it is not the case. I have heard a number of Ukrainian leaders, in fact, do this at different points in time, but I think it has to be systematic and not just only at certain levels and consistent. Here, I think that this is one area I know from the assistance that we provide and what we do. My own view is that I think we need to do a much better and a much stronger job. We have not always paid attention, and it's challenging. Ukraine has multiple challenges. You have the conflict on the Eastern Front. At the same time, you also have economic reforms and the anti-corruption campaign. You also have the need to mobilize and provide unity of purpose. And then at the same time, it's also providing that diplomatic interaction and dealing with such disinformation. It's a lot. It's a strong, very difficult agenda. So from that standpoint, I think you raise a very important point and something that we should work on together.
Thank you very much. And the last question, what steps should Ukrainian government make to have the effective policy and to stop the war at last, in your opinion?
Well, in this case, you know, Ukraine has engaged in the Minsk Accords. And by the way, I personally would have liked to have seen the United States at that table and engaged with you. But starting with that, the first issue is a ceasefire. And a ceasefire meaning really a ceasefire. There have also been efforts in this regard to also have a pullback across the border of Russian troops and Russian hardware.
I apologize for interrupting, even if it is violated by Russian army and Russian-backed separatists.
Well, that's what I am saying, that here, first, the terms of Minsk, they need to be adhered to. One is a ceasefire. That has not been met. Because although there has been, I would say, not the scale that occurred previously, there are, as I hear on this visit, reports of continued violations going on. Secondly, as part of that discussion and agreement, that troops would go, Russian troops and hardware would go across the border. They would get off Ukrainian territory. And thirdly, let me add in this mix something that is not part of your question, but I think is very important, is the issue of the displaced, the internally displaced, the some 1.5, 2 million people who they have a right to their homes, they have a right to peace, and their lives have been terribly disrupted. They also want to have a stake in the political future of Ukraine, and they have every right for that stake. In other words, at that right time. That's part of their future. So toward that end, I think there are some very basic aspects of this agreement that have to be met and have not been met.
Thank you very much for your time. Thanks for joining us. You are watching Ukraine Today. Back to the news.